when you look at the history of West Germany, when you go back to the beginnings of West Germany, and of course the reunited Germany, as you already know is legally the predecessor or continuation of the West German state in an expanded form. So you have probably already learned that there were two options after reunification: either to draw up a new constitution for the reunited Germany, or the accession of the GDR to the constitution, the basic law, the Grundgesetz of the Federal Republic of Germany. And so the second option was preferred. There are still sometimes discussions about that, if that was the right choice, if it would not have been better maybe to draft a new constitution for reunified Germany, but also for practical reasons, it was much quicker. It was decided, well, GDR just joins the German constitutional order, the West German constitutional order, and by that, a new state did not come into existence, but the old state was expanded and continues to exist. And so, in a way, when we talk about German traditions in foreign policy, I refer to the Federal Republic of Germany, because in a way this is in a legal term, the predecessor of the reunited Germany today. And then when we look at foreign policy over many decades, we find that Germany's role today in international politics, on the international stage, Germany's foreign policy is firmly embedded in fundamental foreign policy traditions. So since the Second World War, since the end of the Second World War, we haven't actually seen any dramatic changes in German foreign policy. Of course, Germany has adapted to changing circumstances in the world, to changing structures, particularly after the end of the Cold War, which then, of course, obviously coincided with the reunification of Germany. So there were new challenges to which Germany has responded. But when you look at the main pillars of Germany's international outlook, of Germany's foreign policy, you find that those key pillars, the core foundations, haven't really changed that much or haven't changed at all. And one of these very important pillars is, of course, European integration. West Germany, from the very beginning, was a champion of West integration. Our first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, who was in power for a rather long period of time, from 1949 to 1963, had a difficult strategic choice to make. Of course, there were conflicting demands of what a West German government should strive for once the state of West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, had come into existence in 1949. So there was, of course, a sizable group within the political elite of West Germany that demanded that the government should do everything in their power to achieve reunification as soon as possible. So this was one of the policy priorities of a rather large group within the political elite, across the parties, the political parties in West Germany at the time. So to many, a situation that was characterized by the split of the nation into two states was unacceptable. And everything had to be done, in the view of these people, to overcome the division of Germany as soon as possible and to work towards reunification. But Konrad Adenauer had a slightly different view. He was maybe more of a realist, of a pragmatist, in arguing that, yes, of course, reunification is extremely important and is a top priority of West German policy. But first of all, we have to be realistic about the situation of the Cold War and the antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union. So he didn't think that it was very realistic that reunification could be achieved in a quick process, because he simply didn't believe that the Soviet Union would agree on that. So he thought that in terms of securing the stability of West Germany and to also containing the influence and the threats of the Soviet Union and its allies, it was important for West Germany to unite forces with its West European neighbors and also with the United States. So West integration, forging close alliances with the European neighbors to the West and also with the United States, was the main foreign policy priority and strategy of Chancellor Adenauer. He was in the beginning heavily criticized for this approach because, again, those who favored strong initiatives towards achieving a quick reunification argued that Chancellor Adenauer's strategy of West integration would make reunification impossible for a long period of time, because it would cement, it would enshrine in a way the structures of the Cold War by creating and confirming the existence of two blocks, one in Western Europe and one in Eastern Europe, confronting each other. Konrad Adenauer said, well, that might be true in the short run, but you will see in the long run, in the end, eventually, this policy will lead to reunification. And now in retrospect, we can say he was right. Of course, reunification happened. No one would have thought that, and I don't think that Adenauer himself would have thought that it would take more than 4 decades until this goal, this objective was finally achieved. Anyway, I'm telling you that because it is so important to understand the foundations of German foreign policy, which is still valid today, which is giving really very strong emphasis to the European integration process, which of course started in 1951, now exactly almost 60 years ago, with the 70 years ago, sorry, with the founding of the European Community for Coal and Steel. And I'm not going into the details of European integration now, but you know what followed up from that, the treaties of Rome, the Treaty of Rome, and the establishment of the European communities, 3 different communities as they were called later, subsumed under the roof of the European community, which then became the European Union, the common market, and the common currency, free movement of people and labor, and all that. So all the benefits we enjoy of European integration today, the foundations were laid in 1951. This was the beginning. And Germany since then, since this very day, has always been a main engine of European integration. And although you hear often criticism of the European Union, of European integration, and people are sometimes unhappy, yeah, of course, sure, there are deficiencies. There's maybe even a lack of democracy in decision-making at the level of the European Union in Brussels. Not everything's perfect, but we always have to acknowledge, and I think this is a very, very strong argument in favor and in support of European integration, that we owe many decades of peace and stability in Europe, indeed the longest peace period in the history of Europe, to the European integration process. Of course, we can never be entirely certain about that, because as Mike as political scientists or social scientists in general, we of course cannot simply make an experiment like in the natural sciences and see what would have happened without the European integration process as a component. Maybe Europe would have been stable and peaceful anyway, but I doubt it. I doubt it that we would have achieved the same degree of stability without the European integration process, which has brought tremendous benefits to all its participants. That's my view on it. So I strongly believe in European integration, also because I grew up with it. I grew up in the southwest of Germany, so I grew up in the western part of Germany. Never would have thought that one day I would live in the eastern part, in Rostock, which was very difficult to access for us when Germany was still divided. And now this is still, I still get very emotional about this, I have to say, because I experienced it myself. I experienced the process of integration when the border controls were abolished, when we could freely move first in the western part of Europe, and then later with the expansion. You hear about this a bit later in the second session today, the expansion of the European Union to the east, when all the Eastern European countries, or most of them, also became members of the EU, and we could freely move there, and we could interact with people there. I think this is a fantastic achievement that is unequaled by anything that I have experienced in my lifetime. I still get very emotional when I think about this, and also when I think about German reunification, because when I was young, we never thought about that. Also when we had to discuss it in school, because it was part of the curriculum to think about and discuss Germany as one nation, and so our teachers had to make sure that we were well informed. But actually in the southwest of Germany, close to the French border, close to the Dutch border, we couldn't be bothered. For us, it wasn't relevant if there was another state with, well, part of the German, whatever German nation. And so many of my friends and I, we didn't have any family ties with people in East Germany. So this was a distant place. Far more distant than France or the Netherlands or Belgium or Luxembourg, all countries that we could reach within just 2 hours. So this was our world, this was our universe in a way. What happened in the East mattered less to us. But when it actually happened, it was fantastic. It's something that everyone who experienced it on the 9th of November 1989, when the wall came down, is very difficult to describe. And it's still, after all these years, after more than 30 years now, still something that I found very, very exciting, not because it has given me the opportunity now to live in this beautiful part of Germany, which was, as I said before, very difficult for us in the West to access. But also in general terms, I think I only appreciated and realized what it was meant by the notion of the German nation when reunification had actually happened. Okay, to cut a long story short, these are 7 relatively grumpy looking men. These are all our male chancellors in the history of West Germany and the reunited Germany. And one chancellor, you know her, Angela Merkel, nearing the end of her chancellorship. There will be elections in September, as you probably also know. And there will be a new chancellor, male or female, we don't know that yet. One of the most exciting elections that I can remember, at least, with an open result, which we cannot predict at the moment. So everything can change, or most can stay the same. Both options are on the table, and we don't know yet. But regardless of how these of the specific norms and values these different chancellors have represented, and the different policies in Germany they have pursued in internal policies and the reforms they embarked on, they are basically all shared the same foreign policy priorities. Well, there have been times when Germany's relations with the United States were not as good as during other times, for example, but these are nuances. By and large, the main foreign policy outlook of Germany has never substantially changed. And I mentioned European integration, and what I also have to mention here as well is a related second very, very important pillar of Germany's international role, which is relations with France. So Germany and France have been the driving forces of European integration, and it was very important both for the German government after the Second World War and also the French government. You see here a picture of Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle in the 1950s, was to mend this very, very conflictive relationship between the two nations, which had been really arch enemies for many, many decades, fighting three wars with each other. And the fact that reapproachment happened very quickly after the Second World War was amazing, actually. And so France proposed the European Community for Coal and Steel. So France was, in a way, the father of one of the fathers of the European integration process, but the country that came up with a very specific proposal on how to achieve the first step towards West European integration. And as I said before, Konrad Adenauer was very happy to agree. And you see here pictures from the preceding, from the subsequent decades with different chancellors and different presidents in France, but they all had very, very close relations. And you can argue that whatever happens in Europe, whatever proposals are being made to reform the European Union, to intensify, to deepen the European integration process, they are first coordinated between Germany and France. And I will give you an example for that a bit later. And I just want to mention this picture, which is really a picture and an event of great, great importance. It's the Chancellor Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of reunification, as we call him, and the French President François Mitterrand. And here they met and held hands, which was an amazing, really, expression of friendship, obviously, in Verdun. And Verdun is so important because it was one of the main battlefields in the First World War, where thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers lost their lives. Verdun stands for all the cruelty of the First World War and the catastrophe, if you like, that is associated with this war. I mean, a war is always a catastrophe, but it cannot get much worse than the First World War, and especially what happened there in the north of France. And this was in 1984. 10 years earlier or 20 years earlier, that would have been unthinkable for a German head of government and a French head of government to jointly meet at Verdun to remember the atrocities of the First World War and the lives that were lost. But Helmut Kohl also had a personal relationship with Verdun because his father was a soldier there. He fought there during the First World War. So this is one of the most important pictures, I think, symbolizing German foreign policy before reunification, because there is no stronger expression for German-French friendship than this picture from 1984. Well, you know the way to reunification already. You have talked about this. I wanted to show you some pictures again of the so-called Monday demonstrations in the autumn of 1989 that paved the way to the. I have to look at the chat. Yeah, okay, thanks for this intervention on France. We will come back to that later, and we can discuss that because I think that's a very important aspect. So the Monday demonstrations, also here a picture from Rostock, that eventually paved the way for first reform process, short-lived reform process in the GDR, in the German Democratic Republic, the fall of the wall, and then eventually reunification. And you have also heard from Stefan Kreuzberger already that this is again the fall of the wall and the excitement related to that. You have already heard that the reactions of the great powers, the Allied forces of the Second World War, which still had some strong influence in Germany because of the special statute and their role as protecting powers in Germany. So they had a say, of course, in the process of reunification, and most were rather skeptical in the beginning. The only one who was rather relaxed about the whole thing was George Bush Sr., the US president at the time. And he said, well, if that's the wish of the German people, so be it. The United States is not going to intervene. Of course, the United States were also interested in a strong Germany, and they immediately saw the potential of a larger, stronger Germany being an even more useful ally to the United States. But this was not the perception shared necessarily in other capitals in Europe, not in Moscow, not in London, and also not initially in France, where governments were concerned about a growing influence of Germany and maybe even a re-emerging hegemonic role, or at least the attempt by reunified Germany to play a preeminent or hegemonic role in Germany. So they were initially concerned about that. But then during these several months, and it was a very short period of time from November 89 to the 3rd of October 99, when the reunification finally happened. During this short period of time, these few months really, they all came round and then supported German reunification, because they realized very soon that there was no alternative to that this was the wish of the people in the western part and the eastern part of Germany, and there was no way stopping them. It's a very short summary. You have done this in much more detail. And just again to show you the dramatic impact in a way, and you can see this particularly in Berlin. So this is what is now the Potsdamer Platz during the division of Germany, which was enforced border areas here, part of the wall between East and West Germany, Berlin, sorry. And this is how the Potsdamer Platz, the same area, looks today, right? So there is no better metaphor, I think, to demonstrate the dramatic changes that have taken place than pictures of the Potsdamer Platz today and back then. Okay, so Europe has changed dramatically as well. I already hinted at that just as a point of reference, and I'm not going into the details here because you have a session on the East toward expansion of the European Union. But of course, it's always interesting and enlightening, I think, to look at the maps then and now. The division of Europe, the blue area as it was always presented, the NATO member states, most of course also, not all of them. The EU of course was bigger than NATO, but almost all NATO states are also members of the EU. Of course, Turkey is not a member of the EU. Norway is not a member, but closely associated, and Iceland is not an EU member either. So there is not 100% overlap, that's clear. But here you see the NATO states and also then the states of the Warsaw Pact. So these military bloc systems, these two military alliances confronting each other. And today we can present the whole map in blue, if you like, not presenting NATO, of course, in this case, but presenting the European Union. Unfortunately, there is one former member, which is the UK, which I think is still a very sad story that the UK left for all the wrong reasons, of course. And well, I still believe that they will soon regret it, but that's a story for another day. And then you have the green countries, which would like to be members of the EU and have been involved in negotiations with the EU for many years already, but there is no immediate prospect for them of joining the EU in the immediate future, I would say. Very difficult and complicated issues related to that. Just as a point of reference. Okay, maybe. Well, I said before, no real dramatic changes in terms of foreign policy outlook and international role of Germany. But when you would like to pinpoint a substantial change, then it is Germany's military role, or the role of the Bundeswehr, of the German armed forces within the international environment. So what the UK, France, and Russia were so concerned about initially was the fact that Germany would, or this was the presumption that a reunited Germany would be very strong in military terms, because everyone thought that, well, the West German armed forces and East German armed forces will just join together and then present a very, very powerful army. And this is what initially happened in a way when the GDR army, the Volksarmee, was integrated into the West German army, the Bundeswehr. And suddenly there were more than 500,000 soldiers in Germany. This was more than during the peak of the Cold War in the early 70s in the case of West Germany, when we already had, I mean, most of the time during the Cold War, we had close to 500,000 soldiers, but then it really dropped very quickly. Suggesting that, of course, the German military in the reunified country was not the sum of its parts, really. And, well, the structure of armed forces has changed anyway. So less soldiers, more equipment, more technology, more modern weapon systems, and so on. And so now, unfortunately, this graph, I didn't find a more recent one. This stops in 2015, but the number has slightly increased again. So in January 2021, January this year, there were 184,000 soldiers in Germany. But it's not just the number of soldiers that first caught everyone's imagination after reunification. It was also that the reunified Germany expanded its military role because according to our constitution, the German military forces are not supposed to, they're actually forbidden to operate outside the NATO area. So what they can do and what they're supposed to do is, of course, is to support other NATO members in cases when they are attacked. So that's for sure. But outside the NATO area, German armed forces are not to be deployed. And so this has slightly changed with the particularly engagement of the German Bundeswehr in Afghanistan and Mali. So there are different operations in global terms where the German military is now involved, but they can only be involved for peacekeeping purposes. They cannot participate in active combat. So there, for example, there was no, even if the German government would have wanted to support the United States in its war against Iraq in 2003, the German government opposed this war anyway. But if they had wanted to support the United States, they would not have been able to send German troops to Iraq because that would have been an involvement in active combat, which is not covered by the constitution. But to show more responsibility and make a stronger contribution to world stability and world peace, it was decided that Germany could no longer stand at the sidelines and let others do the job, first and foremost the United States. So there should be a German contribution, also military contribution to peace building. And this is also, of course, strategically important, for example, to make sure that Afghanistan is safe and secure, and that developments in Afghanistan and the whole region do not represent a threat to Germany. So this could easily overspill and affect Germany at some point. And well, for these two reasons, because Germany's own strategic interest in terms of directly securing the peace of Germany and to prevent any threat from emerging to the integrity of the German territory. And secondly, a stronger contribution to global responsibility shared with others, with the UK, with France, with the United States, to contribute to international order and peace. So these were the two reasons why that Germany became stronger in military terms after reunification. So here you have a very important implication of reunification. It's also one of the most significant ones. Well, in the survey, we also touched upon Germany's economic power, and this power is really immense. You can see here that Germany is the fourth largest economic power in the world according to GDP. There's a big gap between Germany and China and the United States because these countries are so much bigger, of course, but not that much of a gap in comparison with Japan, and then well ahead of number 5, the UK. So in Europe, Germany is the strongest economic power. And then also when you look at trade, Germany is one of the largest trading nations. Our wealth, if you like, our GDP, and ultimately also GDP by per capita, depends to a large extent to exports. And our main export partners, our main trading partners, are China in first position, the Netherlands, the United States, France, Poland, Italy, Switzerland, the UK, Austria, and the Czech Republic. And you see here how important the European Union is for Germany, because out of these 10 most important trading partners, 8 are EU member states. And here you can appreciate why Germany is a main champion of the European integration process, and why Germany is so much interested in keeping the vision of a united Europe alive, and why Germany does everything in its power to strengthen this process and to prevent it from weakening and to deepen European integration further. Because it is certainly in the German economic interest to do that, because our standard of living, if you like, depends on open borders, depends on the possibility to trade freely within Europe. But, well, benefits also come with obligations. And since reunification, Germany's role within the EU has become more prominent, which is, of course, also related to the fact that Germany has become bigger, for this very simple fact. Since Germany is the strongest EU member states economically and in terms of GDP per capita, it is also the state that contributes the most to the budget of the European Union. So here, unfortunately, I found this only in German. Germany is a net contributor to the EU because every country pays into the budget of the European Union. This is not just some nominal membership fees. So these are large amounts of money that need to be contributed to the budget of the European Union, because otherwise the European Union can't do its work. So every country contributes, but every country also benefits. There is not, and this is a common myth sometimes in public debates in Germany, that there's the impression that Germany does not get anything out, but only pays in, which is of course not true. Here, for example, in our state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, you can see how much this part of Germany has benefited from EU contributions towards improving the infrastructure. So the EU supports regions within Europe, makes sure that regions that are behind others can catch up, get economically stronger, that the standard of living, which will never be completely equal and equalized within the European Union, but at least that the gap between rich and poor in the EU is reduced, and all that. This not only applies to countries like Bulgaria, for example, or Romania, but also to regions within Germany, for example. So every country contributes, but every country also benefits. But there is, of course, a balance sheet in the end. And so countries are classified according to whether there are net contributors or net beneficiaries. This means the red countries here are those that pay more into the budget than they get out of it, and the green countries are those that get more out of it than they pay in. Of course, this is only a balance sheet in financial terms. It doesn't really account for the benefits that Germany has as the result of European integration, for example, for being able to trade with other EU member countries. And you cannot put a financial value on peace and stability anyway. So this is, of course, sometimes a bit misleading, because it only shows really the bare facts of money paid in and money that is paid out of the budget. But if you look really only at this financial aspect, then Germany is the largest net contributor to the EU, pays more into the budget than it gets out of it. So Germany is very important for the whole operation of the European Union, because it substantially contributes to financing the EU and with that the European integration process. So 3 quick case studies. The Greek financial crisis, a long time ago already, at least in your perspective, I guess. For me, it doesn't seem to be that long ago. After the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, Greece was one of the countries and the country in the EU that suffered the most, because many structural problems in Greece came to the fore as the result of this crisis. So there was an immense state debt. So it was the Greek debt crisis. So basically the state was bankrupt. If that ever happens, that a state goes bankrupt, then Greece came very, very close to that scenario. And this developed into a danger for Europe, for the European Union in general, because Greece is an EU member. Greece has the EU as the euro as its currency. So, there was also the concern of a spillover effect to other countries. So something had to be done. And eventually Greece was saved, and the measures that were put in place that were extremely expensive, running into billions and billions and billions of euro to support the Greek state, to bail out the public sector, if you like. And this was achieved to, first of all, loans on a large scale for Greece, a debt restructuring program, and also a very strict reform program that had to be implemented in return. So the government in Athens was forced to implement far-reaching reforms. They had to reduce the public sector. They had to reduce pensions, for example. They had to reduce salaries in the public sector. They had to close or they had to restructure the economy to some extent. So all very, very tough measures. And of course, the population, the people in Greece, they suffered. I mean, pensions, for example, were not very high anyway, but then they were further reduced because savings had to be made. So the European Central Bank, the other EU member states, and the International Monetary Fund that got involved into helping Greece to survive, put very, very tough conditions on Greece and made sure, closely observed, that these conditions were also met. In the end, really, I mean, Greece still has a very large public debt, but the immediate crisis was managed to the extent that Greece could continue to stay in the European Union, and that the whole European Union did not collapse. That was one of the real threat scenarios at the beginning of the crisis, that this could spell the end of the European Union. But, well, it all came at a price for Greece, as I said, very tough measures that had to be put in place. And this was mainly blamed on Germany. You had some rather nasty comments in Greece about Germany's role. I mean, there were, even some comments in Greece comparing Merkel to Adolf Hitler, and suggesting that Germany wanted to exert hegemony over Greece, because the perception was that Germany was behind all that Germany was pulling the strings, that Germany was orchestrating this rescue plan for Greece with its very tough conditions on the country. And this wasn't completely untrue to some extent, because the German government, Angela Merkel, played a very central role in hammering out this rescue plan. And there were suggestions, not just in Greece, but elsewhere too, that Germany was doing all of this only for its own benefit. And this is related to the third question of the survey, or the second one. Is Germany acting mainly in relation to achieving its own benefit? That this was done to save the European Union, to save the common market, and to make sure that Germany's economy does not suffer. Well, there is no wrong and right in this debate. This is important, though, as a matter of perception, because perceptions matter a lot in international relations. And this was one of the rare occasions, I have to say, since Germany became reunified, that some at least got the impression that Germany was pursuing its own interests rather even somewhat aggressively, right? And the first time that, well, Germany was not really perceived as a threat, but some also saw the really constructive contribution of Germany in this crisis. But again, some also thought that it was a bit too obvious maybe that strong German interests in its own benefit were behind that. And then the case two, the so-called refugee crisis of 2015, 2016. I always say so-called because I don't think it was really a crisis, because a wealthy country like Germany can deal with the influx of 500,000 people from abroad, even if they come at once. It did not challenge the state. It did not challenge our economy. It did not challenge our democracy. Initial reactions also were quite positive, and this is what these pictures refer to, that refugees were welcomed in Germany, that people thought, well, we had a responsibility. And also Angela Merkel, who was very much behind this very positive approach of Germany, and Germany did not close its borders. Germany said, well, and if you are threatened because of your political convictions, you are invited to come. And well, many accepted the invitation and came to Germany. And Rostock was actually the city in Germany with the second highest number of refugees in the autumn of 2015. Many came to Rostock because they wanted to cross the Baltic Sea to move on to the Nordic states, but many also stayed. And Rostock in the autumn of 2015 was somewhat different from what it normally is. But what I think was very, very impressive back then was this immense civic engagement. Also, our students were very prominently involved. And actually, I have to say, in my lifetime, I've never seen another example of such a high level of civic engagement. So people from all walks of life contributed, volunteered to help the refugees who came to Rostock. Basically, day and night, our students were available to welcome the refugees at the train station, to make sure they were brought to the right places so that they could get shelter and food and so on. So I will never forget that. That was that really shows, well, the positive side of civil society, what civil society can achieve, what potential there is. So in a way, it wasn't really the state that organized all that. The state, the government played an important role, of course, by creating the framework conditions. But it was then the civil society that made it happen, that made sure that these refugees were treated well. Unfortunately, this very positive approach and attitude didn't last. And you have discussed it already, I guess, yesterday within the context of German politics. The emergence of right-wing populism in Germany, the strong performance of our right-wing political party, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, is to a large extent, at least, related to the refugee crisis of 2015 and the concerns that people then had a bit later on about an influx of foreigners in Germany and all the issues related to what this means to the German nation, to German culture, and so on. Then coming back, and I'm almost coming to the end, also related to the idea of defense. I already talked about Germany's contribution to military operation, but then there has always been the vision of a European army. And the idea of a European army is as old as the European integration process itself. Actually, shortly after the European Community for Coal and Steel was established in 1951, France proposed to establish a European army. And West Germany agreed to that after some concerns, but then it accepted the proposal of France. And so did all the other members of the integrated Western Europe at the time. But then it was France, the government had changed later, and the new government did not support the idea anymore. And then the idea never materialized. And to this very day, of course, we don't have a European army. We have closer coordination and cooperation related to security within the European Union and with regards to the external relations of the European Union. But there is no European army. And the idea has been floated time and again. And most recently, during the presidency of Donald Trump, when, of course, you remember that Trump was really opposed to multilateral arrangements and was questioning also the value of NATO. And this is again when ideas came to the fore again about strengthening European integration, because there was a perception that Europe, that Germany and France, for example, could not entirely rely on the protection of the United States and NATO anymore. And this is when Angela Merkel again proposed the idea of a European army. And like so many other initiatives and proposals before, it was first coordinated with France. And Macron, the French president, also supported this idea, came out in strong support. So they basically both reinforced their visions for a European army. But then it has become a bit more quiet now again, now that we have had a change of government in the United States. And Biden, of course, has a much more positive attitude towards multilateralism and NATO again. Let's see what we have in the chat here. Yes, okay, so I would also thank you for the comment on refugees. Let's revisit this. I would like to conclude with a short video on Nord Stream 2 as a last case example for a somewhat ambivalent role or perception of Germany at the moment. Because you might have heard about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which connects Russia with Germany, a gas pipeline. Actually, there's already a pipeline, which is Nord Stream 1, and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline runs in parallel. And so it makes sure that gas can be directly delivered to Germany, and with that, the European Union, without having to pass through transit countries like the Ukraine, which in a way, this is of course the often heard perception elsewhere, makes Germany and the EU very dependent on Russia, but at the same time more independent of eventual or potential, I wanted to say, conflicts in this region. And we know that Ukraine is not particularly stable. Or there are some concerns that gas supplies could be interrupted. So that's why there's a preference for a direct link. So I show you a short video, just 2 minutes from the BBC that explains the whole story.
The relationship between Germany and the United States has been turbulent since Donald Trump came to power.
I think it's a horrible thing that Germany's doing.
He's attacked Germany's trade surplus, its NATO contributions, and now there's another source of contention.
It's a horrible thing that you have a pipeline coming from Russia. Germany is a captive of Russia.
Under the Baltic Sea, engineers are already laying a pipeline. It'll bring more Russian gas and, some fear, more Russian influence into Europe. There's already a pipeline in place, Nordstream 1. Nordstream 2 will run alongside it from Kingisepp in Russia to Greifswald in Germany, doubling its capacity. This is where that pipeline, Russian gas, is due to arrive on European soil. It's still a building site, but it's also become a political battleground. This is the valve that shuts the gas on or off. There's one at the Russian end too. Right now, a lot of Europe's gas is piped in via Ukraine, which Russia pays as a transit country. Ukraine's worried that once Nord Stream 2 is complete, Russia will mothball its pipeline. There's still a lot to do, but they reckon they'll get all of this finished by the end of the year. There is still, though, opposition from within the EU, and America isn't giving up either. They're still threatening sanctions on the Western companies involved in this project.
What we are concerned about is increased influence from Russia at this time.
Isn't the truth that America would like to have that kind of influence by selling liquefied natural gas to Europe?
Look, the fact is that the Americans try to sell everything to everybody all of the time. That's capitalism. That's what we do.
But so why object when Russia just tries to do the same?
Well, let me finish my point. We've been consistently against this project even before we had the ability to sell LNG.
No one knows for sure how much gas Europe will demand in the coming years, but as countries scramble to supply and secure it, its political value is rising.
Okay, well, just a very brief summary of this point with Nord Stream 2, because it's also very relevant for the region we are in. For us here in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, this is economically very important. And so our state government is very much in favor of the pipeline, but also within the spectrum of the political parties in Germany, they do not all agree on this idea of having very close relations with Russia. So again, this points to somewhat ambivalent perception of Germany in international relations, but there is, at least as far as official statements are concerned, consensus within the European Union that this project should be completed, and it is now almost completed. So the pipeline is almost finished. Okay, so to conclude, no, I can't go back now to the presentation, but it doesn't matter. But it all ends with what really matters. But if you speak of Germany as a maybe large power in Germany, it does not apply to football. And sorry to my German compatriots that I have to bring back the painful memories of Müller missing his goal kick and the chance of equalizing in the match with the UK. And things would have been so much different if he had kept his cool and put the ball in, but he hasn't. And well, that's it. Germany is out. So Germany might be an economic power, but it is not, and it hasn't been for some time, really a football world power. Thank you very much. It took a bit longer than expected. I spent a bit too much time on the first part when I got really excited about European integration, but that happens sometimes.